Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Karen Gray Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if the Confederacy existed today? Now this video was suggested by our contributor Thomas Watson. So that's why we're doing this video today. To get a lot of the information for this video, I looked at the video which was done by Real Life Law, so definitely check them out. Very similar kind of title, but they tend to focus more on population, the economy, but also like the geography of it, etc., etc. So we've taken some elements from that, but also we're going to add to it in terms of focusing on the political side of it and stuff, right? And like what the different societies, both north and south, would be. So that's kind of what we're going to do in this video. So first of all, we just have to have the massive caveat that when we're talking about southern states, we are not including Oklahoma. This is because while it was one of the Confederate territories, at that time it wasn't one of the 11 southern states. So that's why we're not including it in this list here. So the Confederacy is, all of the South, minus like Oklahoma. Yeah. So that's what the stats for this are. So the stats that we're taking are from the year 2017, and the population of the South would have been 104 million, right? And this is in contrast to the North's population, which would have been 218 million. So that kind of just gives you an idea of just how skewed it is more towards like the North when it comes to population. Also, when we look at the economy, we can see that while the North's economy would be 13.5 trillion, which would make it the second largest economy on Earth, the South's economy would be in fifth place at $5 trillion. So it's still a pretty significant size, yeah, but it's obviously not anywhere near as big as it currently is. And obviously America's economy as a whole would be drastically reduced through this division. However, in spite of this, when it comes to the military spending of for this video, we'll just say the non-South, just to make it easier, right? The military spending for the non-South would still be astronomically huge. It would still be by far the largest military on Earth, right, at $450 billion. And the South's economy would be in third place, just behind China, at $160 billion. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how huge America's military budget is, that even, splitting the two places up, they would still have the first and third largest militaries on Earth. And then when we look at it in terms of the number of troops, we can see that the non-South would have a combined military force of 1.2 million service people, and the South would have 1.15 million. So this is kind of different from how it was in the days of the Union versus the Confederacy in like the 1860s, where the population and like the number of troops was so heavily skewed towards the Union. At this point now, it's kind of leveled out a little bit, and this is mainly because with regard to the US military, there's a disproportionate number of service people who come from the South as opposed to the other regions of the country. So this is why it's kind of disproportionately skewed towards the South in this thing. This is why even though one's population is like twice as large as the other, in terms of the troop numbers, it's at almost rough parity. Also something to note is that within the federal system as it currently exists, there are some states which are net contributors to the federal budget, and there are some states which are net recipients to the federal budget. Now, what I mean by this is there are some states which have a higher GDP per capita than other states, right? Which means that they have higher standard of living, they have like a relatively speaking a wealthier population, and so this means that they're less dependent on aid from like the federal government, right? So all different states, they have taxes collected by them by the federal government, and like this goes to Washington, and then Washington sends that money out to where it's needed the most. So in certain states like California and Texas, for instance, these places are net contributors. However, certain states such as Mississippi are net recipients, and actually pretty much every year for the last I don't know how many years, Mississippi has received something like it's like twice as much as they've contributed, so for every $1 in taxes that they put in, they receive about $2 from like the federal government. So if we look at it in this way, like if the North and South was to be split up, by and large, most of these kind of like states which are like net recipients, tend to be more skewed towards the South, because like the more extreme end of it is in the South, where there's like the most like poverty. So for the North, it would be a net gain because it would lose states like Mississippi, and it wouldn't have to bail them out. It would mean that the states in the North would have to spend less money, like bailing them out. However, states like Texas, which is like a net contributor, they would have to, either spend more money than they currently do to bail out Mississippi, or they have to impose austerity measures on states like Mississippi in order to like balance the budget of the South. So this is something to kind of like bear in mind that it's not a kind of clear cut as kind of thinking, oh, like everyone can just be like independent and then everyone, the North and South there's not going to be any issues. There will be many tensions within the states, like certain things that exist within the current politics of America will be very different, both North and South. And talking about politics, we can see that there'd be a great skew, from one region to the next year. So the South, since 1980, every single presidential election has voted for a Republican incumbent, right? So, starting with Ronald Reagan and going all the way to the present, it's always been Republican. As a matter of fact, the last Democrat president to be elected in the South was their own Jimmy Carter, who came from the state of Georgia. So this kind of gives you a bit of an indication that, the South would be very, very heavily Republican. And actually, if we look at a snapshot of just the 2020 election, just to give a bit of an indication, we can see that 131 out of 160 electoral college seats, would have gone to the Republicans. So this represents about 82% of the electoral college for the South going towards the GOP. However, on the flip side of this, the non-South would be even more skewed towards the Democrats. So without all these southern states, which tend to vote Republican, the North would basically be made up of largely Democratic states. And we can see this in the fact that in the last election in 2020, the electoral college vote for the Democrats in the non-South would have been 277 to just 378. So this represents about 73% split towards the Democrats. However, something to bear in mind, again, because the Electoral College really skews things in one way or the other, it's a thing where the actual fact when it comes to the population, it would be predominantly Democrat in the North, but it wouldn't be as heavily skewed as the 73%. So, the Electoral College, it kind of makes sense in the sense of, the whole of the United States coming together, and it kind of roughly balances it out. However, when we split up by regions like this, I think that the Electoral College, both in the North and the South, would very quickly be disbanded, because it would be so clearly skewed one way or the other that I don't think it would really last for very long. But something to note is that obviously for, depending on when this happens, the further back in history that this happens, the more divergence there's going to be between the two cultures, right? So just to keep this video very, very simple, because we've already kind of done a video on what if the South won the Civil War. So we're going to assume that we're going to assume that basically the split between North and South in this timeline is much more recent. Certainly, let's say that it happens post the civil rights era, right? Just to kind of keep it really, really simple, because if it happens in the 1960s or before the 1960s, the issue of Jim Crow segregation is going to be really, really prevalent, and as such, Jim Crow would probably exist into the 1980s, if not the 1990s, because basically an apartheid system. Apartheid in South Africa lasted up until 1994. So, if it existed in the South at that point, it probably would have continued to at least the 1990s. So we're not going to really touch on that, because in the last 50 years or so, there has been a great deal of progress within the South with regard to racial issues, to the point where there's not now that much difference between the North and the South in terms of attitudes to race. The South has made a lot of progress in that regard. So race, although it is an issue within America more generally speaking, it's not anywhere near as stark between the North and South as it once was. So race wouldn't really play into much of the politics here, although it does play into the fact of black people tend to vote for the Democrats and white people tend to vote for the Republicans. So maybe if the voting patterns were still consistent along these kind of racial lines, maybe then that's how the politics of it would manifest itself. But for the most part, I think that the main difference between the South in the current timeline and the South in this timeline would be the fact of, the South is obviously the Bible Belt. This is where, you have evangelical Protestantism being in the ascendancy, absolutely dominant there. And so a lot of the different state legislatures in the South have tried throughout the last few decades in particular to impose some sort of Christian, not Christian theocracy in that kind of sense. Yeah, it still obviously would be a democratic kind of system, but they've tried to impose certain things which under the US Constitution, they're not able to do because of this separation of church and state. You know, that they've wanted to push certain things both in the schools and in the courts, etc., which the US Supreme Court has struck down because they said that it's unconstitutional. However, without the US Supreme Court having jurisdiction over the South, more likely than not, what would happen is that many of the southern states would be able to be more free and like kind of go towards like having more Christian, explicit like Christian kind of doctrine like kind of imposed on the states. And most notably of all, we would see this in the case for abortion rights. You know, so obviously the famous case of Roe v. Wade in 1973, this legalized abortion across all 50 states, regardless of whether the majority of people in these states want it or not. And so I think more likely than not, if the South was to split away from the North, Roe v. Wade would very quickly be overturned and abortion would either be made illegal or it would be greatly restricted in nearly all of the Confederate states. And you can pretty much see this with pretty much every other like a social issue in America, yeah. Whether it's whether it's abortion, whether it's gay marriage. You know, for instance, the U.S. Supreme Court had to impose like kind of gay marriage on all of the states, regardless again whether they want it or not. And I know that the polling on this is quite old and stuff because things probably changed now. Like kind of like the majority position is probably now in favour of gay marriage in these states, but as of like being able to find like the polls on this, yeah, you can find that the majority of people in the states of Alabama and in Mississippi were still opposed to the concept of gay marriage at the time at which the Supreme Court struck it down. So while obviously social attitudes do change, it's something to note that the South in particular would be much more socially conservative when it comes to issues like to do with like tradition and all these kind of things, right? On the flip side, the North would be a lot more socially liberal than the current United States is, and obviously, the South would be a lot more socially conservative than the current United States is. Yeah, the North would be. The way to think of it would be that it would be slightly to the right of modern day Canada. So it'd have a lot more like welfare spending than currently is the case. But at the same time, its economics would be slightly to the right of Canada, and so things like kind of universal healthcare might happen eventually at some point, but it's not. Especially in those early years, it still would be a lot of the kind of like status quo being maintained and stuff. But then obviously the South would be, much further to the right, as we said, and would be, more focused on like states' rights. It would be more focused on, well, obviously it's a confederacy, so it'd be much less focused on kind of like the federal system that you currently have, which is more centralized and more in favor of like big government and like kind of like welfare spending and stuff. So it's kind of something to bear in mind here, that like both the North and the South, like depending on when it diverges, even if, let's say for instance like the North and the South diverges today, you'd see that like as time goes on, the two cultures would become more and more different. Like the systems of government would be more different, the economies would become different. So that's something to really bear in mind. And also, realistically, I think that the political parties as they currently exist would also diverge as well. I don't, for instance, think that like, as the current Democratic and Republican parties are made up, I don't think that they would kind of exist in this time. I think that, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party of the South would become, more right-wing as such, right? You might even see the creation of new parties to kind of like replace the old one, because like in the South, why would they kind of continue with this old kind of like Democrat-Republican kind of system? And then on the flip side, in the North, again, like the Republican Party, if it were to exist, would become a lot more socially liberal, as would like the Democratic Party. But then again, more likely than not, like the parties would change. Like you'd probably have different parties being created that would better reflect the situation both north and south of this new border. So it's kind of something to really bear in mind, that like depending on when this happens, or like if ever this was to happen, it's the thing where, as things currently stand on the ground, the further like along the road that you kind of go, the more of a diversion that there would be and stuff. So that's something to really kind of bear in mind. So, if you enjoyed that video, don't forget to hit the like button and obviously subscribe if you haven't already. Share with at least one friend, so share one video with one friend. We obviously have over 100 videos covering a wide range of different topics, and so there's bound to be something out there for someone that you know. On top of that, also, we're going to be coming off of the alternative history series, and we're going to be moving on to film reviews in the next few months. So if you have any ideas for alternative histories, please get them in now. This video is obviously suggested by a contributor, and the next video is also one suggested by a contributor, and this is going to be on what if Dewey beat Truman. Anyone hear that? Damn you, ice cream man! Every summer. Anyway, older viewers of the channel will know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so the next video is going to be on what if Dewey beat Truman. So this was a very, very close election in 1948 between Dewey and Truman. And it was a situation where everyone expected for Dewey to win, so much so that even like the newspapers like printed it out. And then lo and behold, Truman winning. However, in this timeline, we're going to assume that the so-called Dixiecrats, who were like the Southern segregationists, who had previously been loyal to the Democratic Party, but because Truman had shifted the party platform to becoming more in favour of civil rights, out of protest, they split away and formed their own party, and they wanted to basically put pressure on the Republican Party, but more particularly the Democratic Party, to basically say that, like, look, if you don't have the solid South, if you don't have if you don't support our right to have states' rights to have segregation and etc., then you're not going to be able to win future elections. So you'd basically have to kowtow to us. So we're going to assume that the Dixiecrats are able to be more powerful in this time, and so much so that basically Truman is unable to win, and so this ends up having long-term ramifications over the next few years, where the Democratic Party ends up being more closely aligned with the Southern segregationist cause than is currently the case in our time, because around that time, this is when you start to see the beginning of de-alignment. This is when you start to see the Democratic Party heading more and more towards being liberal and being in favour of civil rights, and basically leaving the Southern Dixiecrats behind, and for them to eventually be picked up in many cases by the Republican Party. And so with that being said, oh, hold on, just remembered, we've set up a Patreon account. Check the link in the description. So yeah, we've set up a Patreon account. I already handed in my notice for my job, and so I'm going to be leaving that in mid-July, and so I'm going to be focusing on this full time. So it really helped the channel out, it really helped me out a lot. We want to obviously expand this and build this into a proper business and stuff. It's also going to include some merchandise as well. So far from speaking to some people, they've been interested in kind of coffee mugs and pens and key rings and stuff. I'm holding fire at the moment on t-shirts and hoodies and hats and stuff, just because I want to see how well the small things do, and also those things you can kind of have those things in office space, and it's kind of a conversation starter, whereas I think t-shirts is something which we will evolve into and stuff, but it's something which I don't want to just have loads of t-shirts sat in my house with no one buying them at the current time. So so definitely hit me up in the comment section as to what kind of merchandise you'd want. We've got some design ideas already, so we're basically going to have the logo, obviously, which is why I paid for the logo to be designed and stuff, because I wanted it eventually to be on merchandise. But I'm thinking, for instance, having the logo and then having hello there below, right? So that's basically kind of some of the ideas I'm spitballing. And if you have any other ones, for instance, damn you ice cream man, if you want to see that on a t-shirt or on a coffee mug or something, just give it, it's coming back again, it's so distracting. Ugh. You might not be able to hear that, but it's really distracting me. But anyway, so with all that being said, hope you enjoyed that video, and stay tuned for next time. So, bye.